Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to our read-along Frank Herbert's classic Dune for 2024. I lapsed for a while, but we're now back. I'm hoping that we can get all of this done before the year is over, before I disappear in mid-December. And we are up to these chapters don't have numbers; they don't have titles, so we're just going by early lines, and we're up to the chapter that starts. Paul stood outside the still tent in the late afternoon. Paul Atreides, the heir to Duke Atreides, who's now dead, Paul is now the Duke, he and his mother, the Lady Jessica, an adept of the Bene Gesserit, are out in the desert of Dune. They have been chased away by the fall of House Atreides. No one in the rest of the novel is really sure whether they're alive or not. They are as alone as two people can be, they think. They're out in the desert. They have a bare minimum of equipment to survive, to reclaim water from the endless desert that is Dune. And they have each other. But they don't have any of the support that they had. The remnants of the Atreides fighting men that we saw in the last chapter are nowhere around. They don't know that their Duke is alive, their young Duke is alive. They don't know the Lady Jessica is alive. They are instead confronted with the wilderness of Dune, in which you have two major adversaries. One is a lack of water. You have to reclaim as much water from your body and the environment as possible, or you will die of thirst. And the other are the giant carnivorous sandworms that roam the surface of Dune. Huge things, big as a spaceship, that roam the sands of Dune and are they'll swallow you. They can swallow a whole factory whole, so they can certainly eat a human. Paul and Jessica know that they have to face these two things, and they don't have much of a plan. Their plan, the planet Dune is dotted with old imperial ecology stations. Buildings, in other words, with shelter from the elements and maybe technology, maybe some food or water supplies, maybe communication ability. These stations are dotted throughout the great deserts of Dune, and I guess the plan here, now that their aircraft is down, is to find one of those stations and maybe another one after that and regroup from there. They're completely cut off, just isolated atoms. And they're in the late afternoon here, coming outside their tent, which is it's a still tent because it is also reclaiming moisture from the atmosphere and from their breathing on the inside of the tent, so into little catch pockets. So the idea is to lose as little moisture as possible. And there's a lovely scene here. One of the things that I tend to forget when I'm rereading Dune, as I have done many, many times, is how lovely some of the writing is. Frank Herbert really has a flair for writing about the desert. It really does. Whether it's an alien desert or not, I think it's neat. I want to read you a brief passage where the night is coming down. Of course, this is a hot, thin atmosphere desert planet. So when night comes, it comes quickly. And let's see here. Jessica nodded, walked to the fisher's mouth where she could get a sweep of the desert, and swung her binoculars to the left. A salt pan glared white there with a blending of dirty tan at its edges, a field of white out here where white was death. But the pan said another thing, water. At some time, water had flowed across that glaring white. She lowered her binoculars, adjusted her burnous, listened for a moment to the sound of Paul's movements. The sun dipped lower. Shadows stretched across the salt pan. Lines of wild color spread over the sunset horizon. Color streamed into a toe of darkness, testing the sand. Coal-colored shadows spread, and the thick collapse of night blotted the desert. Stars, with an exclamation point. She stared up at them, sensing Paul's movement as he came up beside her. The desert night focused upward with a feeling of lift toward the stars. The weight of the day receded. There came a brief flurry of breeze across her face. And those little intervals are lovely. Paul actually says in this chapter, a person could make a good life here. And we don't know if he means the planet to rule or just living in the desert. There are animals, there are plants. You could live in this environment. It'd be tough, but you could do it. And you would be totally away from the rest of the cutthroat imperial world. I think that's why this chapter opens with the opening that it does. The opening of every chapter is an excerpt from a book by Princess Irulan, who's one of the daughters of the emperor, the Padishah emperor. And there's a long opening at the beginning of this chapter where she describes life in the Imperial creche growing up. And it's a horrible, cutthroat place where there are repeated attempts on her life, and where her father is routinely provided with buxom dancing girls by the Bene Gesserit, who aren't her mother. I think the juxtaposition there is that Paul and Jessica are feeling briefly a moment of relief at being away from all that human junk. They're just out in the desert where they have themselves to rely on and no one is anywhere around. Of course, they're wrong about that. They are being observed by the native inhabitants of these deserts, by the Fremen, who are at this point in the book unpredictable, to put it mildly. But before we get to that, we get to the main action of this chapter, which is that Paul and Jessica want to travel from their crevasse of rock to a divot near the horizon, which may be another crevasse of rock that may be an Imperial testing station. They just have to cross that sand, which is really perilous to do. Paul knows that the Fremen walk on sand without rhythm. They walk completely haphazardly because it's rhythm that will attract a worm. So if you walk without rhythm, you won't attract the worm. And he teaches that. He helps Jessica to perfect that. And they make their way. They set a mechanical thumping device in their rock crevasse, which is doing rhythmic thumping. And that is guaranteed to call a worm, but also to distract a worm. So they do that to give themselves time to get across the sand to their next destination. And they're almost there. It does indeed summon a worm, and the worm destroys the thumper and destroys a lot of the rock crevasse where they were. But then it hears them and follows them, and they're so close to safety, and they just barely make it. They're inside a rock crevasse, and the worm's mouth is right outside the crevasse, testing the air for them. When suddenly another thumper sounds in the distance. Someone is calling the worm away. And it moves. It relents. It moves away from them. And they don't know what's going on. They dig deeper into the crevasse where they are and find obvious signs of human habitation. They say, well, this is probably a Fremen dwelling. And then a voice sounds from the rock saying, most people aren't happy to find the Fremen in the desert. And then Frank Herbert indulges in his old pulp roots by giving us a cliffhanger. So that's how this chapter ends, is, whoa, we're being observed, someone's here. Jessica and Paul are both stunned that these people could approach so near to them without them knowing it. Because Paul has been trained by the greatest war masters in the Imperium, and Jessica is Bene Gesserit with enhanced senses and enhanced awareness of her surroundings. And she's taught a lot of those tricks to Paul, and yet they are surprised to find that they are surrounded by people, by Fremen. And then the chapter cuts out. So we're going to have to move on to find out what happens. But we don't find out right away. Instead, in the next chapter, we get one of the most tragic things and one of the most tragic little moments in this book. We'll get to it in due time. So we'll get to it tomorrow. So I'll wrap this up for now, and I will see you then. Thank you, BookTube.